Hi, everyone. I'm Amee LaTour, a staff writer on Ballotpedia's Marquee team. And in our first briefing of 2022, we wanted to kick things off with a topic that we've been following since last year, and one that will continue to be a prominent story throughout this year, which is redistricting. About half of states have completed this process, which happens once every 10 years. So we figured this would be a good time to take stock of where things stand now, what potential effects it'll have on the 2022 elections, and what viewers can look out for in the weeks ahead. So to help me do all that today, I have with me Doug Kronaizl, who is also a staff writer on the Marquee team. Thanks for being here, Doug.
Happy to be here, May.
Okay, so tell us what redistricting is and how is it different from apportionment, which is something else we tend to hear a lot about after the census is done.
Yeah, so redistricting is the process of enacting new congressional and state legislative district boundaries, the lines that differentiate one district from the other. Apportionment is related to but distinct from redistricting. So apportionment refers to the decision of how many seats are given to an area, while redistricting is the process of deciding the boundaries for those seats.
Okay, so apportionment happens first and then redistricting.
Yeah, exactly. Because since the number of seats in the US House of Representatives is fixed at 435 by law, it's necessary to redistribute the seats between the states after each census as the populations of those states change. So following the census, which occurs once per decade, seats in the House are reapportioned based on the population of the states. If a state's population has grown, it might gain seats. And then if a population has decreased, the state might lose seats in the House. We received those apportionment figures last year on April 26th.
Okay, and for congressional redistricting, several states gained US House seats and some states lost seats. We have a chart showing that here.
Yep, so the following 6 states, they gained US House seats after apportionment. Texas, which as you can see there, gained 2 seats. Colorado, Florida, Montana, North Carolina, and Oregon. And then 7 states lost seats. California, it was actually the first time that the state has lost a seat after the census that we've seen. Illinois lost a seat, Michigan, New York, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and West Virginia.
Okay, and all right, yeah, so Texas was the only state that gained or lost more than a single seat. That's interesting. So for congressional districts, redistricting can begin after apportionment and after states get the results from the 2020 census, which was on August 12th of last year. That was about 5 months ago now. So how many states have finished redrawing their congressional boundaries?
Yeah, as of today, 24 states have adopted congressional district maps. Michigan and Arizona have approved congressional district boundaries, but those just haven't taken effect yet. And Ohio's map, which was adopted, it was struck down by the state Supreme Court. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that later. So just over half of the states have adopted maps. Plus, 6 states were apportioned only 1 congressional district, meaning they don't have to do congressional redistricting.
Right, okay. So that means 18 states have not adopted congressional redistricting plans yet. Is that right?
Exactly. So if we're looking at the seats specifically, congressional redistricting has been completed for 268 of the 435 seats in the US House. That's around 62%.
Okay. So how does this timeline compare with redistricting after the 2010 census?
Well, things went a little differently after the 2010 census. The coronavirus pandemic had effect on when population figures were released. So after the 2010 census, all 50 states received their local population data sets before the required April 11th deadline. And then obviously in 2020, like we just mentioned, we didn't get those figures until August 12th of 2021. And then in an easier to use format on September 16th. With all that said, this next chart, it's going to show the current comparison of adopted maps, meaning it includes plans which have become law as well as Michigan and Arizona. As you can see, we're running behind where we were last cycle in terms of adopted maps. But personally, I'm a little bit surprised that we're as close as we are to the last cycle's pace because many state legislatures aren't in session as much of the second half of the year. So there were a lot of special sessions that got together. And it's kind of remarkable to me that so many states have completed the process so quickly, given the delays that we saw. So in the 2010 redistricting cycle, there were 32 congressional maps enacted at this point in time, and 12 were enacted in 2012. And then this chart next, it's going to show when states finish redistricting after the 2010 census versus after the 2020 counts.
Okay, that's really interesting. So some states that enacted maps early after the 2010 census were obviously behind this time because of that delay that you mentioned, but some other states enacted congressional maps on or around the same day this time around.
Yeah, exactly. And a few states were even earlier this cycle than the last one, like Colorado, New Mexico, and Virginia.
All right, wow. Well, that's a good summary of the state of congressional redistricting. So thanks for that, Doug. The congressional midterms are more than 9 months away, but you and I know very well that lots of candidates are already campaigning. So can you say anything about how redistricting is affecting these elections?
Well, one area to watch is the number of primaries that feature 2 sitting members of the U.S. House of Representatives. So the U.S. Constitution requires that members of the House are residents of the state from which he or she is elected, but it does not require them to live in the district that they represent. But in most cases, the number of representatives run in election in the district in which they live. But that can be a problem when the boundary lines are redrawn. So there are sometimes instances where members of Congress have to run against each other when their home addresses or political basis of support are drawn into the same district, or when 2 or more House incumbents determine that the characteristics of a particular district after redistricting is more favorable to his or her reelection. So there are currently 5 districts that we know of where 2 U.S. House incumbents have announced their candidacy for the same congressional district for the 2022 elections.
Great. And in the 2012 US House elections, there were 13 races where multiple incumbents ran against each other in the same congressional district. And that was either in the primary or the general election. So this does happen after redistricting.
Yeah, definitely. So there was an article in the Wall Street Journal where David Wasserman, who's a senior House editor of the nonpartisan Cook Political Report, he said that member versus member primaries are nothing new after redistricting. However, he said, unlike past cycles, this year's races are currently between members of the same party rather than incumbents of different parties. So you're seeing current House incumbents facing each other in primaries rather than facing each other in general elections. In his opinion, this emphasizes how this year's redistricting cycle is reducing the number of competitive seats.
Okay, so do we have any other indications of how this could impact the 2022 election?
Well, I mean, there are a lot of analyses out there about how this is going to affect the results of the 2022 midterms and the battle for the control of Congress. A lot of them are generally speculative and often framed from a partisan perspective. However, some neutral observers believe that the nationwide changes to congressional maps don't especially favor one party over another, as much as they solidify each party's control and result in fewer of these competitive swing seats. For example, Nathaniel Rakich at 538.com published an analysis last Wednesday that found that out of the 268 congressional districts that have been redrawn so far, 128 are leaning Democratic and 119 are leaning Republican, leaving just 21 in what the website defines as a highly competitive territory. Rakich's takeaway was that any large-scale partisan shifts so far this cycle have been relatively muted. Instead, we've been seeing this continued trend away from competitive House districts.
All right, well, let's switch gears and talk about state legislative redistricting, which is something every state has to do. How many states have finished that so far?
And currently, 27 states have adopted legislative district maps for both chambers. Again, Michigan's maps were adopted but have not yet gone into effect. Ohio's enacted maps were overturned by its state Supreme Court.
Okay, so that leaves 21 states that have not adopted legislative redistricting plans yet. Is that right?
Yep, that is correct.
Okay, how does that compare to the 2012 cycle?
By this time, the last cycle, we had 33 states that had finished the process. So there's that chart again showing the comparison for you.
Okay, great. And I know we also have a dot chart that shows when each state enacted maps that compares this cycle to last.
Yep, so this is that same state by state breakdown, but this time for legislative redistricting. The first states to redistrict last cycle were New Jersey and Louisiana, and they completed their legislative redistricting in April of 2011 because they were holding elections in November of 2011. Obviously, they weren't able to do that this cycle because the data wasn't available until August. So New Jersey's redistricting deadlines actually appear in their state constitution. So in 2020, knowing that this delay was coming, voters there approved a constitutional amendment to postpone the legislative redistricting process until after their 2021 elections. New Jersey and Virginia both held state legislative elections last November. Thus, they kept their current state legislative districts in place until 2023. What they approved also delays the timeline for future redistricting cycles in case anything like what happened in 2020 with the census and the delays happens again in the future.
Okay. Do we have any early sense for these legislative elections, how the redistricting process might affect them this year?
Nothing on a nationwide level. There will be effects from state to state, but I haven't seen any broad analyses regarding the effect of legislative redistricting on the overall partisan composition of legislatures.
Okay, well, thank you. So you mentioned Ohio a few times. They enacted maps that were struck down by the state Supreme Court. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, so let's start with the congressional map. Last Friday, January 14th, the Ohio Supreme Court struck down the state's enacted congressional map in a 4-3 decision and ordered the legislature to draw and approve a new map. The map that they struck down went into effect last November after Governor Mike DeWine, a Republican, signed the legislation enacting those new boundaries into law. Almost, I think within the week after that they were signed into law, a group of Ohio residents and organizations filed lawsuits challenging those maps. The suits alleged that the congressional map violated the 15th Amendment of the US Constitution and the Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, and that the plan unduly favored the Republican Party and its incumbents while disfavoring the Democratic Party and its incumbents. That's a quote from the complaint that the plaintiffs filed.
Okay, interesting. And then the state Supreme Court sided with the plaintiffs then.
Yeah, so in the majority opinion, Justice Michael Donnelly compared the enacted congressional map to a stacked deck of cards. He described the partisan leans as skewed, adding that Republicans typically win around 55% of the vote in statewide elections in Ohio, but also tend to hold 75 to 80% of the state's US House seats.
Okay, and you said it was a 4-3 decision, so that's pretty close. How did the justices in the minority react?
In their dissenting opinion, Justices Sharon Kennedy, Pat Fisher, and Pat DeWine took issue with the lack of a solid definition behind the word unduly. Specifically, justices said that the court's decision to declare that the maps unduly favored a political party was done without any sort of standard about what unduly actually means.
Okay, so what happens next in Ohio?
The legislature has been tasked with devising a new congressional redistricting plan over the next 30 days.
And the Ohio Supreme Court also struck down the legislative maps, not just the congressional. So this was the first time that Ohio used its redistricting commission for the legislative maps after voters approved a constitutional amendment in 2015 to create it, right?
Yep, exactly. So on January 12th, the state Supreme Court ruled that the state's legislative district maps, which were approved by the Ohio Redistricting Commission, were partisan gerrymanders in violation of the state's constitution. The court struck down the maps and ordered the commission to draw new maps in accordance with the Constitution within 10 days. So we're getting close to the end of that 10-day period now. These House and Senate maps were enacted by the Republican-controlled commission in a 5-2 vote along party lines last September.
So again, we see the court basing its decision on whether it found the map to be a partisan gerrymander.
Exactly, and that is due in part to that 2015 amendment that you mentioned. Voters approved that with the 71% of the vote. That amendment created the bipartisan commission to handle legislative redistricting, but it also set series of guidelines that the commission had to follow when creating new maps.
All right, so when you say that the court said the maps violated the state constitution, you're referring to these guidelines, right?
Yeah, that's definitely a big part of it. The amendment included a proportionality requirement, for example, which tasked the commission with trying to match the districts with statewide vote totals. So during the redistricting process, they determined the Republicans had won 54% of the statewide vote since 2010, and Democrats had won 46%. So under the proportionality requirement, the commission should try to make it so that the legislative districts kind of match that 54-46 split. But in its ruling, the court said that the commission's maps favored Republicans in 68% of the House districts and 70% of the Senate districts, in violation of that proportionality requirement.
Right, and you said they had 10 days total to come up with the new maps.
Yep, that is correct.
All right, and this is the first overturned map of this cycle. Did any states have their maps overturned last time?
After the 2010 redistricting cycle, we tracked redistricting lawsuits in 37 states. And so during that cycle, at least 14 states had to redraw all or parts of their legislative maps following court orders.
Wow. Okay. So this has been a great rundown of where things stand right now. What is likely to happen next?
Sure. Well, we know with the deadlines that are in place that within the next 30 days, Kentucky and Minnesota have deadlines to complete their congressional and legislative redistricting. Pennsylvania also has its legislative redistricting deadline within the next month. And we mentioned, obviously, the court orders from Ohio. If you look ahead 60 days, 8 states have congressional redistricting deadlines and 9 have deadlines for legislative boundaries. As far as kind of coming up pretty soon, Arizona's legislative maps are very close to being completed. They're kind of doing final certification that is supposed to be taking place tomorrow. And Connecticut's congressional redistricting process is in the hands of the state Supreme Court. The special master in that case has just released a proposed map there. And then Washington is also very close to completing its maps.
Okay, well, thanks a lot for this rundown of everything, Doug. We invited listeners to submit questions for this briefing. Here's one question. Are there any states that used redistricting commissions for their U.S. House districts for the first time this cycle?
Yep, there were 2, Colorado and Michigan.
Okay, so to start, what is a redistricting commission and how is it different from what states have used in the past?
Well, in most states, legislators are responsible for redrawing district lines. A redistricting commission is, in contrast, a body vested with the authority to draft and implement electoral district maps. The composition of these commissions varies from state to state, but in general, the commission can take one of 2 forms. You either have a non-politician commission whose members cannot hold political office, or you have a politician commission whose members can hold office. In 2015, the Supreme Court of the United States issued its decision in Arizona State Legislature versus the Arizona Independent Redistricting Commission, ruling in a 5-4 decision that redistricting commissions do not violate the United States Constitution. And so today, 8 states use commissions for congressional redistricting and 14 states use commissions for state legislative redistricting.
Okay, and Colorado and Michigan, like you said, used them for the first time this cycle. So let's start with Colorado. Tell us about their commission.
Yeah, in 2018, Colorado voters approved 2 separate constitutional amendments, Amendment Y and Z. And so these established separate non-politician commissions for congressional and state legislative redistricting. If you look at the partisan makeup of these commissions, each one consists of 4 Democratic members, 4 Republicans, and 4 members belonging to no party. These members are appointed by a panel of 3 judges selected by the Chief Justice of the Colorado Supreme Court.
Okay, so in Colorado, it looks like those amendments were designed to switch the process away from the legislature, like you mentioned earlier.
Yep, yeah, and when it comes time to select the maps, the amendments require that at least 8 of the commission's 12 members, including at least 2 members from those group not belonging to any party, they have to vote in order to approve a map.
Okay, and how about Michigan?
Well, the Michigan Independent Citizens Redistricting Commission, a little bit of a mouthful, the MICRC, was established after voters approved a 2008 constitutional amendment that transferred the power to draw the state's congressional and legislative districts from the legislature to the Independent Redistricting Commission. The commission has 13 members, 4 Democrats, 4 Republicans, and 5 unaffiliated voters or members of minor parties. In order for a map to be enacted by that commission, at least 7 members must vote for it, including at least 2 Democrats, 2 Republicans, and 2 members not affiliated with either major party.
All right, interesting. So both of these commissions, they not only altered how the maps are created, but also set rules for how they're actually approved.
Correct. Yeah, and the MICRC approved its new congressional and legislative district boundaries on December 28th, 2021. Those are going to become law 60 days after they publish a report on them with the Secretary of State.
All right, well, this has been a great overview of the redistricting landscape as it stands now. Doug, thanks so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Amee.
And thanks also to Lauren, our communications associate, for the presentation that was part of today's briefing. We had a lot of material to cover, so we apologize for not getting to more of your questions. If you have any questions that we weren't able to get to, you can email editor@ballotpedia.org, and we'll get you answers to any questions you might have. I also want to remind you that we at Ballotpedia rely on donations for all that we do. So if you like our work and if you want to and are able to support us, please consider donating by going to ballotpedia.org/donate to see the ways you can contribute and to make our coverage possible. If you registered for today's briefing, we'll send you a YouTube link to a recording of the presentation that you can share with your friends or you can use to watch this webinar again. Finally, if you want to stay informed about redistricting, visit our homepage regularly or subscribe to our flagship newsletter, The Daily Brew. It's published every weekday and covers 3 top political stories a day. We have many other newsletters, and you can find a link to a full list of those on our homepage. Thanks for watching. Have a great day and take care.